Hi, everyone.
I'm dancing to the music, man.
Welcome to Liticast. I'm John Robinson. We're here today with Mike Whelan, the host of a podcast that I actually just finished listening to recently called Lawyer Forward. Mike is an author, and he actually was one of the first guests on our Liticast series when we started this back in April. And it is nice to have you back here with us, Mike.
After all this time, your standards haven't raised, you know?
Since we first broadcasted together, my hair grew. I completely shaved my head. My hair grew back, and you still look the same. So,
COVID beard, man. I got to get the COVID beard.
We're going to be talking today about innovation. You dubbed it "Chasing Eureka Moments" in your podcast. It's a very interesting topic because law firms don't traditionally innovate the way that normal businesses innovate. So we're going to dive into how that process works within law firms, how that process should work or could work, how it works in traditional businesses. And we're going to try and give our audience some tactical advice on ways that they can help innovate within their law firm. Is that accurate representation, I think?
That sounds good.
Awesome. Just a reminder to anybody who's watching us, we are live on YouTube. We are live on Facebook Live. We are live on LinkedIn Live. We can see all of your comments, all of your likes. They're all streaming to us here. So please go ahead, post your comments, post your questions for Mike. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Let us know where you're watching from, what firm you're with. We really want to make this as interactive as possible. We have an outline, we have an agenda, but trust me, Mike is much more exciting if we can catch him off guard and give him some questions that he wasn't expecting.
Only say nice things, though. It's the middle of a pandemic. Be nice to each other, okay? That's my...
And to you, and to me. So let's talk about this concept of innovation, right? The podcast that you recently released, it's interesting because those people who have not listened to your podcasts before may have been caught off guard when they started listening. You start talking about World War II and about the discovery of chemotherapy. Talk about mustard gas. It's okay. Bring kids on camera. Don't worry about it.
It's a cat, man. There's like a cat that's decided it's gonna. But yes, my podcast is a lot of storytelling. Which is sort of a weird format choice. And I had somebody tell me yesterday it's not lawyerly enough. And then right after that, somebody told me, thank God this isn't very lawyerly. But yeah, the format is very storytelling. And my book is it's very story driven. And I think we talked about that a little bit the last time we hung out. But, when I'm dealing with persuasion, which is what I do as somebody who, I'm essentially a marketing consultant for technology companies, and you're dealing with persuasion. There's a lot of good science that says you've got to combine data and storytelling. And for me in the podcast, what I want to do is change the culture, and you can't do that without connecting people to stories. So it'll keep you engaged in ways you probably did not expect.
And Mike has confirmed that this is his actual voice. His radio voice is his voice.
We're back. Yeah, this is what I do for a living, folks.
The podcast is very NPR-esque. Some nice jazz music interludes. But all kidding aside, very informative, very entertaining. So if you have not had a chance to check it out, it is available on iTunes. Go ahead and subscribe and keep up to date on Mike's ramblings.
That's exactly what they are. So today we're talking about innovation, which is such a buzzword, so much as to mean virtually nothing. And the reason this was on my mind is I recently read Jim Collins's book, Great by Choice, and he mentions in there the innovation threshold of different businesses. And if you want to compete, you've got to reach at least the innovation threshold of that industry. And as I was thinking about that, I realized the innovation threshold in law is really low, right? Like to be able to, 'cause we're not Samsung, we're not Apple. We don't have to come up with a new thing, to have a release every quarter to make our stockholders happy. That's just not our context. And so there's an argument to be made that we don't really need to innovate, that we don't have R&D departments. It's fine. You could just keep doing it. We're all making a lot of money. And as has been told to me before, one of the problems with the law is that we make too much money. Our profit margins are too high. And so I in thinking about that, I realized that threshold issue is not about whether we can compete with other law firms. It's whether we can compete with other solutions, right? And you see this in large firms where people are going to consultancies with things that consultancies can do because they're usually cheaper, they're usually better project managed. As much as companies can move things to consultancies, they're moving them from big law firms. And in the case of small law firms, it's usually either they're not seeking a solution at all. There's this whole question of the unmet demand in law and the 80% of people who don't go through lawyers to solve legal problems and what's behind that. But they're just looking to other solutions. And so for me, that innovation threshold is defined by not can I do as well as the law firm down the street that's going under? Do we both go under together, right? But can I compete as a solution in a spectrum of solutions? And so for that, I really think that we need to think through how we come up with new ideas.
And this is a problem on both a micro level and a macro level in competing with other law firms, as well as competing with these growing outside groups that are infiltrating the legal space. You've got the big consulting firms who are starting to enter the legal services industry. You've got states like Utah who are considering, shifting really the entire business model for law firms. So, you could look at the innovation outside of the legal space and how companies who rest on the fact that they already have large amounts of market share, taxis versus Ubers, kind of the quintessential example here, right? We got it good. Things are great. Taxi medallions are expensive. We've got a moat. Oh, wait, what you've just done is create an opportunity for innovation for someone else to come in and really just at a macro level step on the industry.
Right. Yeah. And I think I'm trying to remember who it was that posted this on Twitter. Natalie Knowlton, I think it was, said essentially, we're all arguing about who's practicing law, who's engaged in the unauthorized practice of law, which is a term even we lawyers can't figure out what it actually means. That boundary of where law practice starts and ends is really hard to define. And it's because historically, clients didn't just come to lawyers for forms. Drafting a form using custom advice after a conversation, we all know that that's lawyering because you're doing synthesis work, not just analysis work, not just drafting. You're using your brain to give customized advice to we know that that's lawyering. A client doesn't know where that line is. They don't know how to rely on a lawyer for this or that. Do I call a lawyer for just advice, right? Just counsel on how to run my business. And as they've realized that line is really vague, they've started to take what has traditionally been legal work, but is not lawyering, and they're moving it elsewhere. And I think that's the threat that we need to pay attention to. It is true that we're taking traditional legal work, like you gave Utah as an example, we're theoretically giving that to independent paralegals, but independent paralegals have always been able to do that work. The question is whether they're doing it under supervision or not. There have always been outlets that didn't require a lawyer. The question is, can we keep a hold of those things that are not legal services? Can we still keep some ownership of those by being trusted counselors, which to me requires more than just defending our ability to be the ones who fill out the forms?
Absolutely. I'm going to go back to your podcast for a moment, because you went on a topic regarding the scientific method, the process of innovation, and maybe stepping outside of that and how that may work better for innovation within a law firm. Let's talk through the process or the recommended process of innovation within a law firm, and let's start with, how does that actually start? How do you begin this process? Because it could be so overwhelming.
Yeah, I think part of the issue here is that the book Lean Startup got out into the ecosystem, and the idea of it, which is essentially using the scientific method applied to that's software development. They're talking about software development, but that book blew up. And what that book did was take from the scientific method, which is a process for discovery. And the issue with that is, and Nicole Braddock has written about this, what the heck is a minimum viable product in law? The idea behind the Lean Startup is, I've got an idea for some way to serve people a thing I want to try. Let me go put a minimal experiment out there. I'm going to give them some version of it. And if you're in software, you know all about this. You're going to give them the earliest SaaS, product. And over time, you're going to keep adding features. And so you see with all these software tools, every, month, they're adding new features because that's the model. It's just testing, it's experimenting, you're adding back to it. That's the old idea of the scientific method applied to software. But the issue in law is minimum. Like, what does that mean? Minimum is not minimal, as Jordan Furlong told me once. It's not like a low bar. Minimum is still a fairly high bar. And so for you, especially if you're a solo small firm or a firm that's having a hard time justifying doing innovation exercises, now I'm going to go put limited resources into an experiment that necessarily has to be larger than a SaaS product because I've got to be ethical, right? I could still get sued if this thing doesn't work. So we're going at this fairly high bar and putting resources behind that. Well, now we're not really following the scientific method anymore because we're not doing slow iterations. And so the getting back to your question about what is the recommended methodology, it's the idea that you come up with an idea, you minimize it as much as you can, you go test it. In law practice, that just doesn't work. And so in the podcast, I talked about doing something different, not looking for the full right answer, because we can't do that without great expense, but trying to test a bunch of wrong answers. And we can dig into what that means.
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting that you talk about technology companies, because at Litify, we experience this every day, right? We're constantly trying to innovate. And when you look at businesses in general, or I should say specifically law firms, I think there's this idea of law firms thinking of themselves as technology companies in the same way that other businesses would have to think about themselves as technology companies in order to constantly rewrite their playbook, right? You're going to be left behind by others that are, if you are not. And having to embrace this, trying to find incremental ways to improve various areas of your business. Although in law, you don't have the same types of resources that you would have in a traditional business or in a technology business, right? You talked about R&D. How can you start identifying some of these small areas where you can make incremental progress without having dedicated research and development departments? Or, even more specifically, you live in a culture of hourly billing, right? Where time is scrutinized. How do you start that innovation process?
So it's really hard for me to answer that without telling you to hire somebody, because
which may not be the wrong answer.
Yeah,
right?
Because really, we're not, as lawyers, we're not well trained in that, and that's just not part of the training that we get in law school. It's not the kind of thinking we do. We do analytic thinking. We are linear thinkers. That's how we were trained in the reductivist art of breaking something down, analyzing the parts, putting it back together. That's a kind of thinking. It's learning to think like a lawyer, right? We all go to school to learn to think like a lawyer, and that's that kind of thinking. The kind of thinking that takes place in innovation is more synthetic thinking. It's bigger picture. It's paying attention to emotions and perceptions, and they're very different frames of mind. So one way to do it would be to train lawyers to engage in that kind of thinking. That is an approach. Or legal staff. A lot of times, that lawyer, non-lawyer distinction causes all kinds of ruckus. Even if somebody's not a licensed JD, a lot of law firms have people who do not have licenses to practice law, but are still legal thinkers, right? A lot of paralegals that I know, they're analytical think that it's the same kind of thinking. So you can teach all of those people to think synthetically. That is a way to go. Another way to do it is to hire people who are trained in that. In the book Lawyer Forward, I talk about your first hire. If you're going to be an entrepreneurial law firm and try to solve things, if you're trying to come up with solutions, you need to hire a what I call a legal supply chain manager, but it's a design person. That their 4 competencies are design, source, build, and deliver. They care about things like project management and quality control and consumer feedback and incorporating all that stuff. So maybe an unpopular answer, but I think you need to invest some resources in the right kind of people who have the right kind of training. I think that's a really good first step.
What about a culture that has an open door to failure, right? Some of the things that you started talking about were not about trying to identify that something is successful, by identifying that it's not successful. How does that work within a law firm where failure is just traditionally frowned upon?
Yeah, it's there's kind of 2 cliches. One is the fail forward, and the other is to get the right answer all the time. And I don't really believe in either of them. I think lawyers are uniquely good at focusing on finding the right answer. I think it was a Ken Robinson talk where he said, from youth, our kids are trained to give the right answer. And by the right answer, it means whatever it is that the teacher wants. So we're sitting in class and they ask a question. Our brain immediately thinks, not how do I come up with something new, but how do I give the teacher what she wants so I don't get in trouble, right? How do I get that right answer? And necessary to becoming a lawyer is a ton of school, competitive school, which means we are probably pretty good at focusing on what the teacher wants us to come up with. And so we have this culture of being right? And really legislatively, we have to be right. We can't be wrong or we get sued. So there's a big culture of being right. The issue is that in any kind of scientific method, there's a TED Talk that I linked to and referred to in that podcast episode, where he talks about it's all about finding the wrong answers. Really, science is not test a hypothesis, go put it out in the world, find that it worked, Eureka, you win, let's go to the next thing. That's not the way science really happens. Really, it's mostly built on falsifiability, which means you came up with an idea. The experiment is meant to break the idea, not to validate the idea. The experiment is meant to say, here's the context in which you got that wrong. And so what scientists will do is they'll put out a publication that says, here's the result that we found. We think this will work. Now you guys go try it. And then bring feedback. It's a peer review system. You guys go try it in some other context, add some other compound, bring in some other environment, show us how this is wrong. And after they do that over and over again, in 30 years, when it's not been able to be proved wrong, right? When every time it comes up right, it goes from a theory to a law, right? And so for practitioners, here's the issue culturally that I think is the problem. We don't share successes. We definitely don't share failures. There's a lack of a culture of sharing. And I think really this necessary step of sharing failures so we can see whether it's a law or not, or just a theory. I think step 1 to that is not sharing failures. I think it's just sharing. I don't think we have a lot of systems for crowdsourcing knowledge which is the wrong word for that, but the way we use it often, we don't collect our knowledge. We don't even have a culture of mentors anymore. We don't have people showing up at bars after our time at court and listening to the old lawyer, talk for 30 minutes about the good old days, right? We don't even
get out of our house.
Yeah, we haven't had this culture of mentoring for a while, much less data sharing. And data sharing is where innovation really gets tested. I did another podcast episode recently on Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who did a lot of research on the fact that we rely on too little data to make decisions. We'll take really small sample sizes and say, this is true. Nowhere is that more obvious than in law firms, because we have tiny sample sizes. Even a large firm is a medium-sized business in the scheme of things, right? Litify is built on Salesforce, I think. Take a company like, that's a big company, right? That is a big firm. Jones Day is not a big firm. Baker Botts is not a big firm. Salesforce is a big firm. Those law firms are mid-sized firms in the big picture. And so they just don't have enough data to be able to draw widespread conclusions. So anyway, back to the original point, we've got to have a culture of sharing if we want to actually come up with changing innovations that matter.
And is that, how do you suggest that happening, right? And I think that it potentially could be in two different directions, right? You've got data and quantifiably, but also qualifiably, right? Having more forums and communication. What are some of the things that we can do to overcome that?
Yeah, well, first on the how not to do it, I'm in a bunch of Facebook groups in Texas for Texas lawyers, and for a long time, they were great mentoring resources. People could go on there and post questions and everybody would answer. And it was just a great way to get some knowledge sharing. It was a knowledge management platform for small firms, and it was great. And recently, it's turned into racist, misogynistic, violent nonsense because every Facebook group eventually becomes that. I often quote from Batman, your Facebook group either dies a hero or lives long enough to become a total mess. And that seems to happen with these social networks. So I do think there's a curation thing that needs to happen. I think some organizations need to figure out the value of hosting conversations and actually curating them. There's a lot of downside to crowdsourcing. But the other thing I think that firms can do is go through universities. There's a huge disconnect between legal practices and law schools. And that's a disaster. Academics are talking to themselves. Like my whole career is built on going on to SSRN and turning what these professors say into English because it's not English. They're just talking to themselves. And the same with practitioners. We're sort of ignoring what's going on in the academic world, and that's creating all kinds of issues. You see what's happening at UC Hastings, I think it is. Maya is there with the firm that she works with. I can't remember. And then Kimball, who's at BYU, who's working with a firm as well. What a lot of these universities are able to do, these law schools are able to do, is say, hey, you 5 different firms who would never normally work together because you're competing, we can be the hub. We can bring all of you together. We'll gather the data. We'll gather the questions. We'll put them together in one place and make it so that you can all share data back and forth. I think whether you're creating sharing communities in a place like Facebook or sharing communities in universities, the sharing needs to happen. That is a crucial step.
It's ironic. What we're doing right now is participating in this, right?
Sure.
We have a forum where we're talking about these things. We're encouraging others to talk about them. This episode that we're on right now will live forever on the social networks where it is posted on. The comments that are posted will live forever. We recently created, a few months ago when the pandemic started, we created a Slack group, right? Just to get lawyers and technologists together to talk. I'm in some of the same Facebook groups that you're in, Mike. There's definitely opportunity, I think, to discuss, but also opportunity to innovate just in that. Like, what is the right forum now that we know that we're going to be living remote for the foreseeable future, for the most part, right? How do we connect when we can't be in person? Going to the bar at happy hour isn't going to happen.
And I mean, this gets to the question of what innovation is in the first place. If you read the book, The Diffusion of Innovations, what he talks about a lot is that an innovation just means it's new to the person who's doing the thing, right? So he gives the example, there's a bunch of studies that have been done about hybrid seeds, about how to get farmers to start using seeds. Well, by the time that seed gets to the farmer that's further down the adoption curve, it's not new anymore. It's not some crazy new idea that's never been heard of before. It's just never been heard of by that person. And so these groups fill this function of the network science that applies to innovation. The fact that people work in networks. I don't adopt something new until someone I know and respect tells me I should try that new thing. That's the diffusion of innovations. That's how it works. And that's a bucket. And I would put you guys in a bucket for that. Go to Facebook groups, chat about things, talk about things, but recognize that that's mostly social. That's mostly about network science. It's not about innovation in the sense of coming up with something genuinely new. For something that's genuinely new and you want to test, you have to have widespread data. And I think universities can play a crucial role in that.
Excellent. When ideas are shared, right? These are concepts that can accelerate the path to innovation. So it doesn't have to be trying to plant a seed and waiting for it to grow and seeing if that was the right seed that you planted in the right climate, right? There are things that are working for others that you can try and tweak a little bit, see if they work for your firm, learn from others. And I think that's another concept that the idea of sharing and community and crowdsourcing can help accelerate, whether it's in a social forum or even just picking up the phone and calling the firm next door that you normally would bump into in some other, other life where we're not living in a pandemic.
Right. And that reminds me of a project that I've been working on, a tool called the Legal Innovation Canvas. And put very simply, it's a visual tool that makes it so when you have an idea, you can ask quick questions of it to see if the thing works on paper. The issue that I have with the lean startup idea that I mentioned before is that I'm going to come up with something, I'm going to go test it, I'll see what the results are, and then we'll pull it back. A couple issues with that. One, we're not very good at gathering data. Again, you've got a very small sample size. So let's say I try something and it bombs. There's so many variations and factors that could feed into that it's really difficult for me as an individual or as a firm to identify what was it that worked about that and what didn't. If it did work, that could be a freak instance too, right?
Sure.
So that's an issue. And again, the other issue is that we have a pretty high bar for what counts as minimum. So what I'm doing with the Legal Innovation Canvas is what scientists do, which is modeling. They don't fly to a distant star to decide, what the chemical makeup is of that star. They're using models based on what they know now. Models are imperfect descriptions of reality. They are not reality, but they help as a process to quickly see, is this thing viable? And so, I can share a link to it with your audience once it's up. But broadly speaking, the Legal Innovation Canvas asks questions like, who are you serving? Right? That's one side of it, is that demand side. What do they look like? What do they care about? How are you connecting with them? What is their emotional journey? On the other side, there's the supply side, which is where we tend to focus as lawyers. It's who do I have in my firm? Who can I connect with outside my firm that can help fill in the gaps? And bridging that is something called the value proposition. It's this middle what is it that I'm delivering? And then at the bottom, there are some different financial filters. And I separate out the financial filter and the mission of the firm, because I think the mission of the firm comes first as a separate filter. Then you ask these business model questions. And then afterwards, you ask the money questions. If you ask the money questions too early, it really kills your innovativeness because you won't come up with ideas. So anyway, all that is to say, I think what law firms need is a way to test without having to push out a minimum viable product, because that minimum bar is so high. I think we need to do a lot more modeling. And again, this will drive people crazy because we hate the word academic, but I think we need to do a lot more academic work. I think that what you saw in the financial crisis of 2008, you saw a big separation between practitioners and theorists. Academics had for years been saying, we've got to stop doing this with the subprime mortgage plant. Like, this isn't working. They had been saying it for a decade. And then when 2008 happened, the whole world was like, holy crap, who could have seen this coming? Well, the people who saw it coming were doing models for the past decade or two saying that this was about to happen. The same with the pandemic, right? The pandemic came out and everybody's, where did this, we could never have guessed. And here's all these academics going, we've been saying this for the last 20 years that this was going to happen. This is an effect of the networks that we've built. And so anyway, all of that, again, to say there is modeling work that needs to be done. I think practitioners need to be a lot more tied to academics. And with tools like the Legal Innovation Canvas, we can do that work of seeing if our ideas work before we put a bunch of resources behind it that we can't afford to risk.
It's interesting you're talking about, being blind to things that are somewhat obvious. We did an episode a couple of weeks ago where we talked all about cognitive biases. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that specifically, Sherry Bellett's joined us. We had a great talk, and she wrote an article on our site. Go ahead and check it out on the blog at litify.com/blog.
Right.
So if in that model that you just talked about, you put money at the end, and you said that needs to be deliberate. How can law firms invest in experiments or in innovation, knowing that probably won't work?
The Postit Note. It is. People ask me all the time, what's my favorite legal tech tool? And I'm like, Postit Notes. Again, the feature of modeling, the value of modeling something, of putting a business idea through a framework like one of the legal innovation canvas, which, by the way, is built on the business model canvas. This is a tool that's existed for a while. This is not me just making stuff up, and I encourage you to go look at it. But the idea of separating out the money is because there's a whole bunch of brain work that can happen long before you have invested a dime. All that brain work can be put up on a wall. You can model it. And the issue with trying to find the right answer in that culture of finding the right answer, and people's jobs being reliant on finding the right answer, the issue is not, can lawyers or legally trained people accept the idea of this might not work? I think the issue is, can the people who hold the purse strings embrace the idea that this might not work? Can those people see the value of being wrong over and over again, even if it doesn't produce an immediate ROI? Because if you come up with, let's say you're going to put an idea through the legal innovation canvas, right? That means up to now you've had 1,000 ideas and you've put them through this canvas, and only 10 of them came through. Of those 10, 9 of them are still not going to work. You're still going to put resources behind them. You're going to put them out in the world, and you're going to say, this didn't work out. It didn't hit the scale that we thought it would. We modeled it. It might have worked. We felt pretty confident about it working. It still didn't work. That's okay. If I was to encourage anyone in a firm, it's not you lawyers, except for the purpose of trying to persuade your bosses. It's you bosses, right? You guys need to be willing to put money into innovation. And if the way you do that is to spread risk across multiple entities, then do that, right? Collaborate with other law firms, collaborate with other industries. Instead of seeing the big four as this giant threat that's coming that you can't do anything about, call the big four. Call these companies and say, how can we work together? We want to come up with something that's beneficial for both of us. How can we work together to do that? You've got to loosen those purse strings to put more money into investment. There are ways to model the financial viability of an innovation, and we could talk about that. But the first thing is to be willing to spend. You just have to be willing to spend.
And it's becoming, or it is, I shouldn't say it's becoming, 4 months ago, I would have said it's becoming a requirement. I'd say right now, it is a requirement to innovate. The world is moving at a pace that we have not seen before, and that pace is only going to be accelerating. And if you're not innovating, you're essentially standing still, and everything is continuing to move forward.
Let's talk about that, because I want to get your take on that, because in terms of traditional legal services, my friend Jordan wrote a book called Law is a Buyer's Market. I'm not sure that that's true, right? It's still pretty well a seller's market in terms of the number of competitors that are out there that are law firms that can practice in this highly regulated market. There's still not, we feel like there are too many players, but there's really not that many. In terms of the amount of capital that goes into the legal industry, there's not that many players, especially if you calculate in the unmet need of legal services. That market is huge, and we don't have that many players in there. So for me to compete is actually not that hard. So when you say, I'm thinking about every company is a technology company now, that idea, what that means, I'm going to interview you now. Tell me more what you mean by that. Why do you think law firms need to innovate to survive? How long do you think that might not be true? Like, when's the drop dead date? Are we in a position where the pandemic is coming and people are you and I are trying to tell people, look out for this thing, it just hasn't gotten here yet, and later people are going to say, John and Mike were so smart, damn it, right? Where are we in that process, do you think?
Well, I think the future is always coming. right? It may not come in as large a swath as what happened over the past few months, but there will always be the requirement to advance and to iterate. Because I'll give you an example here. I used to tell my team, I don't have to do this anymore, but I used to tell my team, if you're doing the same thing today that you were doing 6 months ago, there's something wrong. One of two things could be happening. You're either not doing the right thing, or you are doing the same thing. You're not moving forward, which means you're behind because the world continues to move forward, right? There is no such thing as standing still and being successful. At some point, there will be innovation in legal. I don't think anyone can deny that we're going through some of that right now with some of the consulting firms and what's happening in Utah, but we're constantly moving forward. You have to constantly move at least at the pace of which things are moving, but ideally you're moving faster and you're the innovator and you're the leader, and then everyone is behind you trying to chase you. Because if you're not the leader, you're the follower.
Yeah, it's such an interesting, in that book, Great by Choice that I mentioned, the Jim Collins book, when he was talking about the innovation threshold, he talked about Intel. And he pointed out a bunch of information, stories that came out at the time. Intel did not consider itself an innovation company. It considered itself an execution company. And so they just did the bare minimum innovation necessary. They weren't trying to break the world. They were just trying to do it really well. And so they would meet that threshold, which was, for their particular niche, it was somewhat low relative to other technology companies. It was fairly low, but they just tried to execute on it like crazy. And so getting back to what we need to do as law firms, I think what's really important with this process is to say, you don't have to come up with an earth-shattering idea. You don't have to come up with something crazy. And all these analogies to Uber are total nonsense. You don't have to come up with the Uber for law. Stop believing that. You notice what just happened with the pandemic showing up? We're doing Zoom calls now, and it's like this major innovation, right? We're shaking the world by stopping sending faxes. It's amazing that in 2020, stopping faxes and getting rid of paper is like this enormous innovation. Your bar is actually pretty low. The issue is, do you have a culture that takes those ideas and turns them into execution? Do you do something with it? There's a lot of innovation porn in the industry, right? Just people talking about how we're just writing books to each other, right? We're all recording podcasts of each other. It's a bubble where we're all just taking, pot shots at other people's. It is truly academic. The people who execute, if you're on this call, bless you. The job is to take these ideas and do something with them. It doesn't have to be a crazy great idea. Just keep trying, and they become a culture that executes.
It's interesting. You're talking about like fax machines and Zoom calls. You rewind back to when those things were first introduced, and those were huge, monumental things. I think the problem that we're seeing in legal is that we've waited so long for this to become the norm that we've had to adopt these technologies because the rest of the world has. Not necessarily because we've innovated. There is definitely opportunity to be the leaders. There's no reason why the legal industry can't become the innovators in technology, in customer service, in many other areas.
Yeah, that's interesting because we talked about two kinds of innovation. One is for an individual firm, you might even be far down the adoption curve, which most law firms are. It's still new to you, right? It's still an innovation to your firm. That's cool. Go do that thing. What you're talking about is being on the head of that curve, which is coming up with something genuinely new. I'm debating this myself in my head right now. Do you believe that law firms are the right people to come up with those head of the curve innovations? Or do you believe to do that well, we're going to have to bring in other players who are more adapted to that kind of exercise?
It's a great question, and something that comes up constantly in conversations that we're having. The technology that Litify itself is built on was not built for law firms. We took this technology that is used in every other business industry and we morphed it for law firms. So by looking outside the industry, we've essentially absorbed all this innovation that existed outside of legal and just made it for legal. There's
Right.
things um, like machine learning, right? Einstein discovery, which is something that is embedded into the Salesforce platform that just combs through all of your data and develops insights for you based on things that are happening within the platform. There's, analytics that allow you to take data sets that you could never imagine going through and generating insights from. And literally you build a framework for this report. And as more data comes in, it just refreshes and shows you in real time what's happening. This is not technology that was developed for the legal industry. It's stuff that was developed outside that then gets adopted for.
Right. Nor could it have been. Like the resources it would have taken for Litify to match that thing. I'm going to ruffle some unpopular opinion alert is a trigger warning. If you are creating a company that uses the phrase built by lawyers for lawyers, that might be a problem. The issue that I have with that idea is it makes sense for marketing purposes. Lawyers are very territorial, and we tend to believe things from lawyers more than we believe them from other people, which I find fascinating because nobody else believes lawyers, but we do. So there's this obsession with saying made by lawyers for lawyers because we understand our very unique context. But you take this situation with Litify would never have had the resources to build what Salesforce has built. Litify is a niche, right? Product. It's in a vertical in a particular industry. And while Salesforce had the resources to spread the risk of coming up with something new across a ton of industries, Litify doesn't have that advantage. And so your ability to go tap into other competencies and then just apply it to our context just seems like a much shorter route to me. So we can talk about this, but I really do think that what law firms and what lawyers need to do, and this is not original to me saying this, is stop thinking that everything needs to be law and, right? That somebody is a lawyer and that you can hire incredibly competent people who know nothing about the legal context, but are really good at what they do, and then teach them the legal context. You see this in Susskind's books. He talks about our crew of lawyers having to learn a bunch of different skills, and I just keep debating. I don't know if that's the right way to go. Is it really faster to teach lawyers a bunch of these skills than it is to teach lawyers how to work with other people?
Right. Or to teach people who don't understand law at the get-go.
Right. The context.
The context and why these things are important and relevant.
Unpopular opinion. Sorry, guys.
Not here. I think it makes a ton of sense, and it's directly applicable to what we're talking about. If you need to look outside of people who are like you, right? Is a very important topic right now going on across the country. Right. If you surround yourself with people who are just like you, you're going to all think alike. The algorithms on social media are built this way to reinforce the opinions that you like, that you share, that you comment on. When in reality, the most innovative things that can happen to you individually, right? We're talking about things outside of your traditional sphere of influence, are maybe commonplace everywhere else. So lawyers think about the things that are happening outside of the legal industry, may be very, very easy for you to just take some of those things and adopt them to your practice.
Yeah, in fact, if you read the book Diffusion of Innovations, he makes the point that let's say there's a circle, a cluster of a bunch of friends who agree with each other, and like you're talking about, it's that kind of crowd. You need essentially two kinds of people, one that's outside and one that's inside. The person outside is crazy, right? Nobody inside the group trusts them. They're outside. They're just trying crazy things. This is not the made by lawyers for lawyers person. They're outside the circle. You need that person because they're going to do things you would have never thought of. But then inside the circle, you need somebody who is well-versed, right? The media is the relationship that he talks about in that book. Those people read a lot. They're the people who are looking out for innovations. They have to be able to reach outside of that bubble and then bring it in and persuade their people to do it. So I think if I'm in a law firm and I want to change culture, that is something that I would try to be. I would try to be the host. Seth Godin refers to it as the impresario, the person who organizes the conversations. Try to be the person inside the company who brings those outsiders because people trust you. you as the lawyer don't have to become the innovative. You don't have to become Steve Jobs. That's not required. You can still move the needle by being the host, by being the person who brings in the outsiders because you're trusted.
I think where we wound up on this episode is very much more important than where we started, because we've come up with a very easy way for people to innovate at their law firm. And the answer is look outside of your law firm.
Sure.
Look at what's going on outside of the legal industry, what's going on outside of your specific law firm, and identify things that can be applied, because that may be one of, not the only, but one of the quickest paths to innovation within your firm. Mike, I very much appreciate you joining us today. Where could our guests read your posts, catch your podcast? Where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm mostly on Twitter because it's cheaper than therapy. It's at Mike Whelan Jr. and Whelan is spelled Whelan. If you go to lawyerforward.com, you can read about the book and you can order a book from there. Is another place. And of course, the Lawyer Forward podcast is out there that you can listen to as well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for watching, whether it was live or recorded. And we will see you next week for more of our Liticast episodes. Find us on litify.com/Liticast. If you haven't joined our Slack community yet, we are continuing to grow. You can also find that on litify.com. Thanks, everybody.